Why do you have the exact same birthmark as me? Annie blurted out, the question escaping so quickly that she had no chance to stop herself. Claire Whitmore turned halfway around, one hand still holding the front of the silver evening gown she had not yet finished putting on. What? She frowned, clearly confused as to why Annie had suddenly stopped when the zipper was only a few inches from the top of her back. Annie's hand remained suspended near the zipper, but every sound around her seemed to drift farther away. Backstage was still alive with rolling racks of gowns, assistants calling out designers' names, hangers clattering against metal rails, and the low pulse of music from the ballroom vibrating faintly through the partition. At the far end of the corridor, a stage coordinator was loudly reminding everyone that Claire had only a few minutes before she was due to appear. Annie barely heard any of it. Her eyes were locked on the small patch of skin that had just been exposed behind Claire's left ear. That, Annie said, raising a finger without touching her. The birthmark right behind your left ear. Claire reached into her hair, found the spot, and pressed a fingertip lightly against it. This, Annie, it's just a birthmark. It's not that you have a birthmark. Annie stepped closer, unable to take her eyes off it. Look at the shape. It looks like a drop of water. And there's a tiny brown dot underneath it, slightly off to this side. Claire had started to turn toward the mirror, but stopped completely. How do you know about the dot? Because I can see it. Claire gathered her hair over her right shoulder and tilted her head toward the mirror. Something that had been part of her body for 18 years suddenly became something she needed to examine again. She studied it for a few seconds, then tried to pull the moment back toward normal with a smile. All right, you've discovered my birthmark. Tonight's greatest mystery has officially been solved. Now can you please finish zipping me up? They're about to call me. Annie still didn't move. Wait. Claire looked at her through the mirror. Annie. What now? I have one too. Claire let out a quiet breath, impatience beginning to show. A lot of people have birthmarks. No. Annie shook her head. I mean, I have this exact one. The smile disappeared from Claire's face. Annie stepped around in front of her. She swept her thick dark hair to one side, lifted the section behind her left ear, and tilted her head. Look, Claire looked, and this time, she couldn't speak right away. The calm in her eyes abruptly hardened. Her body leaned instinctively closer to Annie, as though narrowing the distance might somehow make what she was seeing less impossible. It didn't. Behind Annie's left ear was the same narrow, teardrop-shaped birthmark. The bottom was slightly rounded, the outer edge curving gently, and just beneath it sat a tiny dark brown dot, almost exactly where the one beneath Claire's birthmark appeared. Claire touched her own ear, then looked at Annie again. No way. Annie let her hair fall. That's exactly what I thought when I saw yours. Claire stepped closer. Wait. Lift your hair again. I want to look at it properly. Annie did. Claire didn't touch her. Her hand hovered a few inches from the mark, as though she was afraid that if her fingertip made contact, the whole thing would become more real. The top is the same, Claire said, her voice quieter now. The angle too, even the little dot underneath. Annie looked directly at her. Now do you understand why I stopped? Claire didn't answer. She spun toward the full-length mirror, swept the hair away from her left ear, and tilted her head from one angle to another. When she still couldn't get a clear enough view, she shoved the makeup chair aside, its wheels scraping sharply across the floor. Come here. Annie walked over. Claire, you still have to go on stage. Just 1 minute. Claire pulled Annie closer beside her and adjusted both their hair to the same side. Stand right there. Don't tilt any farther. The two young women turned their heads slightly toward the mirror. Their shoulders almost touched. One wore a custom-made silver gown, its stones catching the light with every movement. The other wore a simple backstage staff uniform, a temporary employee badge still clipped to her chest. The distance between their lives might have been almost impossible to measure, but in the mirror, none of it seemed to matter. There were only two birthmarks, both on the left, both in the same place, both shaped like a narrow drop of water, both with the same dark speck just beneath the edge. Claire braced one hand against the makeup counter, her eyes fixed on their reflections. Maybe we're making them look more alike than they really are. Annie turned toward her. Why would I want to do that? Claire didn't answer. Claire, what exactly do you think I'm trying to prove? I don't know. Claire lightly pinched the edge of her own ear. I'm just trying to find a normal explanation. Then find one. There was no anger in Annie's voice, but the words silenced Claire anyway. Annie reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and opened the camera. All right, no more looking through the mirror. Let's take pictures. Claire turned toward her. Pictures of what? Mine first, then yours. Same angle, same distance. It'll be easier to compare them on the screen. Claire took the phone. Hesitation still written across her face. You really want to take this all the way? Annie gathered her hair up again. If we stop now, that's what will drive me crazy. Claire said nothing more. She brought the camera closer, centered the skin behind Annie's ear in the frame, and took 2 pictures. Done. The second one is clearer. Annie checked it quickly, then moved behind Claire. Your turn. Move your hair. Claire swept all of it over her right shoulder. Annie lowered herself slightly to match the angle of the previous photograph. She steadied the phone, adjusted the distance, and pressed the shutter twice. Then both of them leaned over the makeup counter. Annie opened the picture of her own birthmark first, then Claire's. She switched back and forth. Once, twice. On the third time, Claire took the phone from her hand. Wait. She enlarged Annie's photograph. Then her own. Claire's finger stopped. This. Annie followed her gaze. The little dot? Claire nodded very slowly. It's not just underneath. It's offset to the left by almost exactly the same amount. Annie felt the warmth drain from her palms. Claire resized both images to match, then flipped between them faster, as though desperately searching for some difference she had missed. There wasn't one. Suddenly, she set the phone down on the counter. No. Annie frowned. No what? Claire turned away, drew in a long breath, and planted both hands on her hips. I don't like this anymore. You thought it was funny at first. At first, I thought you were making too much of it. And now? Claire looked back at the screen. Now I don't know what to think. Annie crossed her arms. You could start by admitting this is really strange. Claire exhaled sharply through her nose. Fine. It's really strange. Really? Claire turned toward her. Strange enough that I want someone to walk in here and tell me we're overlooking something ridiculously simple. Annie pointed at the phone. Then tell me. What's the simple explanation? Claire didn't answer. From the hallway, a woman's voice called out, Claire Whitmore, 2 minutes. Claire remained where she was. Annie watched her, then suddenly noticed another change in Claire's expression. It wasn't simple confusion anymore. Something had sparked behind her eyes. A connection. Something Claire didn't want to say. Annie caught it immediately. What did you just think of? Claire reached down and picked up the phone without unlocking it. Nothing. Don't tell me it's nothing. Annie leaned slightly to catch Claire's eyes. A second ago, you were trying to convince yourself these birthmarks had nothing to do with each other. Now you look like you just remembered something. Claire tightened her grip around the phone. There's a photograph. Annie went still. Claire glanced toward the curtain leading to the runway, checking whether anyone was coming, then lowered her voice. About 2 years ago, I found it inside my father's safe. Annie felt her curiosity immediately turn into something heavier. What kind of photograph? My father when he was much younger. Claire paused. He was standing beside a black woman. Annie said nothing. Claire continued, more slowly this time. They were in a hospital. Annie pressed her lips together. And? Claire looked straight at her. They were each holding a newborn baby. Annie didn't move. Outside, the music climbed into a louder section, and then the stage coordinator's voice came from so close that both of them heard every word. Claire, 90 seconds. Neither answered. Annie touched the phone screen. The 2 photographs of their birthmarks were still displayed side by side. 2 babies? Claire nodded. Did you ever ask your father who they were? Yes. What did he say? Nothing. Nothing at all? Claire's mouth curved slightly, but there was no humor in it this time. He locked the safe and told me never to open it without permission again. Annie stared at her. Claire suddenly held out her own phone. Send me those 2 pictures. What for? Just send them. Annie sent the photographs. Claire watched until they appeared on her screen, then immediately locked her phone and slipped it into the small bag on the counter. After the show, Annie frowned. After the show, what? Claire turned as if she were about to leave. Annie caught her wrist. Not hard. Just firmly enough to stop her. You just told me there's a photograph of your father, a black woman, and 2 newborn babies. Annie held her gaze. You can't say something like that and then walk away as if we were talking about a pair of shoes. Claire looked down at Annie's hand around her wrist. Then she raised her eyes. The uncertainty in them had hardened into determination. After the show, we're going into my father's office. Annie released her wrist. To do what? Claire reached for the part of her gown that was still unzipped, turned her back to Annie, and answered without looking around. To find that photograph. Annie stood motionless for several seconds. Claire reached behind herself and touched the unfinished zipper. And Annie, what? Claire met her eyes through the mirror. If these birthmarks really are connected to that photograph. She stopped. For the first time since the conversation began, Claire wasn't trying to smile, explain it away, or turn it into a coincidence. Then tonight we're going to find out what my father has been hiding for 18 years. Claire had barely stepped off the runway when the applause from the ballroom was still rolling through the walls like the fading echo of a great wave. On the other side of the curtain, several photographers kept calling her name, asking her to turn back for one more shot. Camera flashes washed the hallway in bursts of white, but Claire never looked back. She lifted the hem of her silver gown off the floor, slipped between two clothing racks being pushed in the opposite direction, and headed straight toward the staff area. Annie was standing beside the timesheet table. She had just put down the pen, her worn canvas bag already hanging from one shoulder, while one hand unclipped the radio from her waistband. Claire was moving so quickly that the hem of her gown brushed against the edge of an accessories bin. She didn't even glance down. She went straight to Annie and caught her by the arm. Don't leave yet. I need you to stay for a few more minutes. Annie looked at Claire's hand on her arm, then up at the stage makeup still covering her face. My shift is over. I have to return the radio, check the wardrobe station one last time, and catch my train. If I miss the last one, your 5 minutes turns into almost an hour for me. I know, Claire released her, but she remained directly in Annie's path. Just 5 minutes. It's about my father. Something in the way Claire said those last two words made Annie stop putting the radio away. Did you tell him? Not yet. Then why are you keeping me here? Claire glanced down the hallway and waited until 2 event employees had passed before lowering her voice. Because if I wait until after you leave, he'll tell me I saw it wrong, remembered it wrong, or connected things that have nothing to do with each other. I want you here when I tell him. Annie slipped the pen into her shirt pocket. Maybe he'll be right. Claire looked straight at her. You don't believe that. Annie didn't answer. Inside her pocket, her phone suddenly seemed heavier than it had a few minutes earlier. The 2 photographs were still there. Annie's birthmark, Claire's birthmark, 2 teardrop shapes that looked disturbingly alike, with the same tiny brown dot, both sitting behind the left ear. Annie was about to say something when footsteps sounded from the direction of the ballroom. Richard Whitmore appeared at the end of the corridor. He had taken off his suit jacket and draped it over one forearm. His tie had been loosened after the long evening, but his stride remained neat and decisive, carrying the air of a man accustomed to hallways clearing for him before he ever had to ask. 2 members of the event staff followed several steps behind while Richard kept his attention on his phone until Claire stepped directly into his path. Dad, I need to talk to you right now. Richard stopped without immediately looking up. If it isn't urgent, it can wait until we get home. The foundation board is still waiting for me upstairs. Then they can wait another 5 minutes. Only then did Richard look at his daughter. Perhaps he noticed that Claire did not look like a young woman who had just finished the most important public appearance of her evening. He motioned for the 2 staff members behind him to continue on. Once the 3 of them were alone in the corridor, Richard finally turned his attention to Annie. His eyes passed over her temporary staff badge, her black work clothes, and the canvas bag on her shoulder before returning to Claire. What is this about? Claire reached up and swept her hair away from her left ear. Look at this. Richard frowned slightly. Your birthmark? Yes, I know it. Annie has one too. Richard glanced at Annie once, almost out of politeness. All right. Claire froze. That's all? Richard furrowed his brow. What do you want me to say? I want you to actually look. Claire, 2 people having birthmarks behind the same ear doesn't prove anything. You haven't even looked at hers. I understand what you're saying. No. Claire shifted sideways until she was standing closer to Annie. You're trying to end this before you've even bothered to look. A flicker of irritation moved through Annie's chest. She didn't like standing in the middle of a hallway, having to prove something about her own body to a man who hadn't even known her name a few minutes earlier. Still, Annie slipped the strap of her bag from her shoulder, gathered her hair to one side, and looked at Richard. "Mr. Whitmore, just look. If you still think it means nothing afterward, I'll leave." Richard was silent for a moment before he looked. Annie lifted the hair behind her left ear. He glanced at the mark only briefly, then looked away. "Yes, you both have birthmarks in the same place. Unusual, but not impossible," Claire immediately said. "You didn't even look at the little dot underneath." "I don't need to." "Why?" Richard folded the jacket over his arm, smoothing each crease with almost mechanical precision. "Because a coincidence does not become evidence, simply because we stare at it longer." Annie let her hair fall. "I'm not asking you to turn it into evidence." Richard looked at her. "Then we agree." "Not exactly." Annie pulled the bag strap back onto her shoulder. "I just don't like being treated as if I'm trying to invent a story." That answer finally made Richard look directly into her face. Claire immediately stepped in. "Dad, stop talking to her like she came here trying to get something from our family." "I didn't say that." "You're acting like it." Annie raised one hand. "It's fine. I'm leaving." Claire turned toward her at once. "Wait, not yet." Richard checked the time on his phone. Claire turned back, no longer bothering to soften the subject. "The photograph." Richard's fingers stopped against the edge of his phone. It was the smallest movement, but Annie saw it. The coolness in his expression didn't disappear, but something new had appeared behind it. "Caution." Richard lowered the phone. "What photograph?" Claire held his gaze without blinking. "The photograph in your safe." Richard stayed silent longer than usual. Then he said, "Not here." Claire gave a short, dry laugh. "There's always another place and another time with you. But somehow the right time never actually comes." "Claire, you just said these birthmarks mean nothing." Claire gestured toward Annie. "But you keep a photograph locked in your safe of yourself standing beside a black woman in a hospital. There are 2 newborn babies in the picture." Annie immediately turned toward Richard. "2 babies?" Richard did not answer her. Claire continued, her voice never rising, yet every sentence pressed harder. "Annie has a birthmark identical to mine down to the smallest detail. Same left ear, same shape, same little dot underneath." "You really think that deserves one quick glance?" Richard ran his thumb along the edge of his phone, his gaze still fixed on Claire. "I think you're connecting things that may have nothing to do with each other." "Then prove it." Richard narrowed his eyes. "How?" Claire answered immediately. "Open the safe." The air between the 3 of them seemed to pull tight. Richard said nothing. Claire moved half a step closer. "If the photograph has nothing to do with this, open the safe. Let us see it. And then this ends." Richard shifted his attention to Annie. "Your shift is over, correct?" Annie understood immediately. He did not need to tell her to remove herself from a family matter. The question had done it for him. "Yes. Then you should go home." Claire reacted instantly. "Dad, don't do that." Annie lifted a hand to stop her. "It's okay." "No, it isn't." Annie turned to Claire first. "I don't need you arguing for me." Then she looked at Richard. "I'm not asking to come into your home. I'm not asking you to open your safe for me. And I'm not asking for money, a name, or anything else with Whitmore attached to it." Richard did not interrupt. Annie took out her phone but kept the screen dark. "If these 2 birthmarks are just a coincidence, fine. I'll go home, sleep, and get up tomorrow, and continue my life. If that photograph has nothing to do with me, even better." She paused. "But if it does, then I have the right to know why." Richard answered evenly. "You have no evidence that the photograph has anything to do with you." Annie did not lower her eyes. "Exactly. That's why I'm standing here asking." For the first time, Richard was no longer looking at her employee badge. He studied Annie's face for a long moment. Her eyes, the bridge of her nose, the shape around her mouth. The scrutiny made Annie more uncomfortable than his earlier indifference, because he was no longer looking at her like an event employee. He was searching for something. Annie recognized it, but she refused to turn away. "You can call the birthmark a coincidence," she said. "You can say Claire is reading too much into it, but she remembered that photograph the moment she looked at me, and I stopped in the middle of doing my job because I saw something on her body that I've carried on mine for 18 years. Neither of us planned any of this." Richard turned to his daughter. "Go change. We're leaving." Claire remained exactly where she was. "Are you going to show me the photograph?" Not tonight. Why? Richard breathed slowly through his nose. Because I said not tonight. Frustration flooded Claire's face. That isn't an answer. Richard pressed his fingers between his eyebrows. For a few seconds, the polished image of the billionaire who managed thousands of employees almost disappeared. He looked instead like a man using the last of his strength to keep some unseen door shut. That's all I'm going to say here. Annie looked between father and daughter, then adjusted the strap of her bag. I'm leaving. Claire turned immediately. Annie, wait. Don't delete those 2 pictures. I wasn't going to. Send me the originals. I already did. Claire gave a small nod. Good. Richard immediately looked at his daughter. Claire. Claire didn't avoid his gaze. If they don't mean anything, then you shouldn't care that I have them. Annie did not wait for his response. She turned away, walked down the service corridor, and pushed open the metal door at the far end. The sound of the gala disappeared when the door closed behind her. The night air hit Annie's face with enough cold that she instinctively pulled her collar higher. She went down the steps in front of the building and joined the flow of people heading toward the train station. The pavement was still damp, and the city lights broke into long reflections beneath passing tires. Annie had gone nearly half a block when she stopped beside a closed storefront and pulled out her phone. The 2 photographs were still there side by side. She enlarged her own, then Claire's. She resized them until they matched. Nothing changed. The same curve, the same tiny dot, the same impossibly precise location. Annie was about to lock the screen when a document sync notification appeared. It came from the folder where she kept records related to her adoption. She almost swiped it away. Then a small thumbnail beneath the notification stopped her finger. An old hospital identification bracelet. Annie stopped dead on the sidewalk. Someone behind her had to step around her. She opened the file. The old hospital band filled the screen. The plastic had yellowed, and much of the printing had nearly worn away. One corner had been creased so badly that part of the lettering was distorted, but 3 details were still clear enough to read. Carter. Annie tightened her grip on the phone. Her last name. She dragged the image slightly downward. Schlieffengischer. Something seemed to close around Annie's chest. October 16. Her birthday. And Claire's. She enlarged the final section of the bracelet. The print was so small that Annie had to bring the phone close to her face. The ink had faded almost to white, but 2 words were still there. She read them once. She didn't believe them. She spread 2 fingers across the screen and enlarged the image again. Then read them a second time. Twin Bay. Everything around Annie kept moving. A taxi passed. The pedestrian light changed. Groups of people continued down the stairs toward the station. But Annie stood perfectly still, as though the street had moved on without her. Her phone vibrated in her hand. She didn't look at the notification. She only stared at the 3 lines. Carter. Schlieffengischer. Twin Bay. If Annie's discovery touched your heart, please like this video, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what happens next in Annie and Claire's story. She opened the 2 photographs of the birthmarks, then returned to the scanned band. Her thumb moved between the images several times before she called Claire. Claire answered almost immediately. Annie? Are you alone? For the moment. Why? I found something. Claire's voice changed. What kind of something? A hospital band my adoptive mother kept. There was a pause on the other end. What does it say? Carter, October 16th. Annie tightened her grip on the phone. And Twin B? Claire said nothing. Claire? I heard you. You were born October 16th. Yes. And you said that photograph showed 2 newborns. Yes. Annie looked down the subway stairs but did not move. Send me your birth certificate. What? A picture of it. I want to see the hospital. Annie, I already told you where I was born. I know what you told me. I want to see it. Claire did not argue this time. Give me 10 minutes. Annie took the train home, but she barely noticed the stops. By the time she reached her building, Claire had sent a photograph of a certified birth certificate. The hospital line read, Street Catherine's Private Hospital, Manhattan. The date was October 16. Annie sat on the edge of Ruth's old armchair and called Claire again. It matches. I know. No, Claire. I mean, everything we have so far matches. The birthday and the hospital. And the birthmarks. Claire lowered her voice. And the photograph. Annie looked toward the small wooden box on the coffee table. Your father knows something. He says he doesn't. He didn't say that. Claire paused. You're right. He said we were connecting things that might not be connected. That sounds like him. It sounds like somebody choosing his words carefully. Claire exhaled. What do you want to do? Annie almost said she didn't know, but the hospital band had changed something. She no longer felt as though she were chasing a coincidence. I want facts. The next morning, Claire sent a message asking Annie to meet at a coffee shop in Midtown. Annie expected Claire alone. Instead, Richard Whitmore was seated at a corner table when she arrived. She stopped beside the empty chair. You didn't tell me he'd be here. Claire looked apologetic. He saw me printing the birth certificate. Richard gestured toward the chair. Please sit. Annie remained standing. I can stand. Richard studied her for a moment, then placed his phone face down. Claire showed me the image of the hospital band. And I agree it raises questions. That's different from last night. Last night you showed me a birthmark. You barely looked at it, because a birthmark is not proof of a family relationship. Annie pulled out the chair and sat. Neither is a hospital band. No, but now you care. Now I have a date, a hospital, a family name, and a notation indicating a multiple birth. Claire leaned forward. So what happens next? Richard answered without hesitation. DNA testing. Annie's shoulders tightened. He noticed. I'm not asking you to decide this second. You already decided what you want. Yes, I want an answer. That makes two of us. Richard nodded. Then we can use an independent laboratory. Independent from you? Yes. Independent from Whitmore Group? Yes. And I get copies of everything? All of it. Annie studied him. Why are you suddenly willing to do this? Richard did not respond immediately. Claire watched him. Dad. He picked up his coffee but put it down without drinking. Because 18 years ago there was a woman named Naomi Carter. Annie felt the name before she understood it. Carter? Richard nodded. Who was she? His gaze shifted briefly toward Claire. Someone very important to me. That isn't an answer. No, it isn't. Annie's patience thinned. Then give me one. Richard's expression tightened. If the DNA says there is no biological connection between us, then the rest may only create confusion. And if there is, then I will answer every question I can. Claire frowned. Why make the truth conditional? Richard looked at her. Because I am trying not to tell Annie a history that may not be hers. Annie understood the logic, but she didn't like how carefully he held the information. Fine. I'll do the test. Richard looked almost surprised. But I choose the lab. You can, and nobody from your company touches the samples. Agreed. And Claire tests too. Claire answered before her father could. Of course. 2 days later, the three of them sat in a private consultation room at a laboratory Annie had selected after checking its accreditation and chain of custody procedures. A technician collected cheek swabs separately, sealed each sample in front of them, and had all three sign the labels. Claire tried to make a joke while filling out her form. This is officially the strangest week of my life. Annie glanced over. You've had better weeks? I've had quieter ones. Richard signed his paperwork without joining the conversation. The waiting was worse than the test. Annie still went to work. She served coffee, cleared tables, and corrected a seam on a jacket for a coworker during lunch. Claire texted twice, then apologized for texting too much. Richard sent nothing. On the second afternoon, all three received the same notification. Results available. Richard asked them to meet at the laboratory instead of discussing it over the phone. The genetic counselor placed the report in front of them and explained the findings in plain language. The probability that Richard Whitmore was Annie Carter's biological father exceeded 99.99%. Claire covered her mouth. Annie did not move. The counselor continued. The comparison between Annie and Claire was consistent with full biological siblings, and combined with their identical date of birth and hospital records. The results supported that they were fraternal twins. Claire's eyes filled. Twins? The counselor nodded. Annie looked down at the page until the words blurred slightly. Then she turned to Richard. Did you know about me? His face changed. Yes. Claire looked at him sharply. Annie's voice dropped. You knew? I knew Naomi was carrying twins. The room seemed smaller. Annie pushed the report toward him. Then where were you? Richard looked at her, and for the first time since she met him, he had no polished answer ready. I was told one of my daughters died shortly after the birth. Annie's hand froze over the page. Claire whispered, "Dad." Annie forced herself to ask the next question. "What was my mother's full name?" Richard met her eyes. "Naomi Carter." Annie thought of Ruth keeping the surname from the hospital band for 18 years because she refused to cut the only thread Annie had to her beginning. Claire looked from Richard to Annie, then asked the question neither of them could avoid anymore. "If Annie and I have the same biological mother." Richard closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he looked directly at Claire. "Evelyn is not your biological mother." Claire did not speak at first. She kept one hand over her mouth, then lowered it slowly as if even that small movement required thought. "What do you mean Evelyn isn't my biological mother?" Richard looked at the report between them. "Naomi Carter gave birth to both of you." Claire shook her head once. "No. Mom gave birth to me." "Claire." "She told me about the hospital. She told me how difficult the delivery was. She told me I wouldn't sleep unless she held me against her chest." Richard's expression tightened. "Evelyn raised you. She was there for almost everything you remember, but she did not give birth to you." Claire pushed her chair away from the table. "You knew this?" "Yes." "For 18 years?" Richard did not try to soften it. "Yes." Annie watched Claire's face change from disbelief to anger. Until that moment, Annie had been fighting her own questions. But Claire suddenly seemed to have lost the foundation beneath every memory she trusted. "You let me call her my mother," Claire said. "She is your mother in the sense that she raised you. That isn't what you just said." "I know." "No, I don't think you do." Claire pressed her fingers against her forehead. "You knew another woman gave birth to me. And you never told me her name?" Richard looked at both women. "I thought Naomi left." Annie's voice cut in. "You thought?" "I was given documents. I was told one of the twins died and Naomi signed papers surrendering her rights to the other." Claire gave a bitter laugh. "And you just accepted that?" "No." Richard's answer came quickly enough to make both women pause. "I tried to contact her. Calls went nowhere. Letters came back. The address I had stopped working. Then my father died. The company was collapsing, and every person around me told me Naomi had made her decision." Annie folded the DNA report in half, then opened it again. "You had money." Richard looked at her. "A lot of it," Annie continued. "Private investigators, lawyers, people who can find somebody on the other side of the country before breakfast. You're telling me none of that crossed your mind?" Richard did not defend himself. "It should have." "That's not much of an answer." "No, but it's the truth." Claire looked toward Annie. "There's a photograph." Annie remembered what Claire had told her backstage. "The one from the safe?" Claire nodded. "I want to see it now." Richard hesitated. Claire's voice hardened. "No more, not tonight. No more when you're ready. We already took the DNA test. We already know she's my sister. Open the safe." Richard looked at the counselor, then stood. "Come with me." An hour later, Annie entered Richard Whitmore's townhouse for the first time. She noticed the polished stone floor, the artwork, the wide staircase, but none of it held her attention for more than a second. Claire walked ahead without removing her coat. Richard led them into his study and crossed to a built-in cabinet beside the bookshelves. He entered a code, opened a steel door, and removed a flat envelope. Claire folded her arms. "That's it." Richard placed the envelope on the desk. Annie did not reach for it. "You show me." Richard removed a photograph and turned it around. Annie forgot the house, the DNA report in her bag, and the man standing across from her. The woman in the hospital bed had Annie's eyes, not similar eyes. Annie saw the same slight upward angle at the outer corners, the same narrow shape, the same expression she had seen in photographs of herself when Ruth caught her laughing. Naomi Carter looked exhausted in the photograph, but happy. Richard sat beside her, much younger, his shirt sleeves rolled up. Each of them held a newborn wrapped in a pale hospital blanket. Claire moved beside Annie. "That's the picture." Annie pointed to the baby in Naomi's arms. "Which one is me?" Richard picked up the photograph and examined a note written on the back. "This one." Annie took the picture from him. Naomi's hand rested across the small bundle against her chest. One finger touched the baby's cheek. Annie's voice came out quieter than she intended. "She held me." Richard nodded. "Yes." Annie looked closer. "She actually held me." "Yes, for years." The absence of information had allowed Annie to create explanations of her own. Maybe her biological mother never wanted her. Maybe she walked away before anyone even gave Annie a name. Maybe Ruth had avoided telling her because the truth was worse. But the woman in the photograph was holding Annie against her chest. Annie ran her thumb near the edge of the image without touching Naomi's face. She doesn't look like someone trying to leave. Richard looked down. She wasn't. Annie raised her eyes. Then why did you believe she did? Richard pulled out the chair behind his desk but remained standing beside it. Because when I returned to the hospital, Naomi was gone. I was told one baby had died. I was shown paperwork indicating she had given up parental rights regarding Claire. Claire's eyes narrowed. Who showed you? Richard's answer came after a pause. Family council handled most of it. That's not a name. Claire. Whose hands were those papers in? Richard looked toward the photograph. Evelyn was there. Claire's face tightened. Mom? She came to the hospital after my father was admitted elsewhere. She said she was helping deal with the legal arrangements. Annie felt the pieces shifting again. And Naomi? I was told she didn't want me to contact her. By Evelyn? Among others. Claire walked to the window, then turned back. Did Evelyn know Naomi was my biological mother when she raised me? Yes. Did she know there were 2 babies? Yes. The answer hit differently. Claire picked up the photograph again. Then she knew Annie existed. Richard nodded. Annie watched Claire's hand close more tightly around the edge of the picture. Be careful with it, Annie said. Claire glanced at her, surprised. That's the first picture I have of my mother. Claire immediately loosened her grip and handed it to Annie. Sorry. Annie shook her head. You didn't know. The words stayed between them for a moment because neither woman could ignore what they also meant. Maybe neither of them had known much of anything. Richard opened a drawer and removed another folder. There's something on the back of the photograph that may help. He pointed to a handwritten series of numbers beneath the date. Annie frowned. What is that? A hospital file number. Claire looked at her father. Can you get the record? I don't know. Annie slipped the photograph carefully back into its envelope. Then find out. Richard picked up his phone. This time, Annie did not see the billionaire from the gala. She saw a father who had just realized that the story he accepted 18 years ago might have been built for him. He made one call. I need someone who doesn't work for Whitmore Group, he said. Someone who follows evidence, not instructions. Annie looked at Claire. Claire touched the birthmark behind her left ear. For the first time, the mark was no longer the biggest mystery between them. The question had moved somewhere darker. Who had needed 2 sisters to grow up believing the other did not exist? Richard made the call from his study while Annie and Claire remained near the desk, the old hospital photograph sealed again inside its envelope. The person he contacted was Daniel Mercer, a former federal investigator who now worked independently on financial fraud, missing records, and cases involving institutions with too much influence over their own paperwork. Mercer arrived the next morning without an assistant, without a company logo on his briefcase, and without any visible interest in Richard's reputation. He was 58, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, and dressed like a man who preferred not to be remembered after leaving a building. Richard handed him copies of the DNA results, Claire's birth certificate, the photograph, and the scanned hospital band Ruth had preserved. Mercer read everything before asking a question. When he finally looked up, he addressed Richard first. What answer are you hoping I find? Richard frowned. The correct one. That wasn't my question. Annie watched Richard closely. Mercer continued. People with resources sometimes hire investigators to confirm a version of events they already prefer. I don't work that way. If the records show you were deceived, I'll say that. If they show you ignored something obvious, I'll say that too. Richard nodded. Then say whatever the evidence supports. Mercer tapped the DNA report with one finger. Good, because this part is already settled. Annie Carter is your biological daughter. Annie and Claire are full sisters. What we don't know is how one sister ended up in the foster system while the other was raised under the Whitmore name. Claire shifted beside Annie. Can you find that after 18 years? I can find what people failed to destroy. The answer stayed with Annie. Mercer began with Street Catherine's. The hospital no longer operated under the same ownership. It had been absorbed into a larger medical network years earlier, and much of its old paper archive had been transferred to an off-site storage facility in New Jersey. Electronic files from that period had also been migrated more than once, which meant dates, timestamps, and internal codes could survive, even when original documents did not. 3 days later, Mercer returned with the first set of findings. He spread copies across Richard's dining table rather than the study desk. Annie preferred that. The desk had started to feel too connected to secrets. "This is Claire's neonatal file," Mercer said. "Complete enough to be normal for the period. Admission, delivery notes, blood work, nursery chart, discharge." He placed a second sheet beside it. "This is the record attached to the second infant." Annie looked down. Several lines were missing. Mercer pointed to the patient number. Twin B existed in the hospital system. There's an admission number, a birth date, and a transfer code. What's missing is everything that should explain what happened next. Richard's expression tightened. "What about the death record?" "That's where it gets worse." Mercer produced another copy. "The death certificate in the archived file doesn't contain the signature of the attending physician listed on duty that night. It has a typed name, but no authenticated signature. There's also no matching entry in the hospital mortality ledger." Claire looked at him. "Meaning?" "Meaning the hospital file says an infant died, but the systems used to record deaths don't support it." Annie felt her fingers press into the edge of the table. "So somebody created a death record. I'm saying the document has serious problems. I'm not saying who created it yet." Mercer pulled another page forward. "There's also a transfer code entered 4 hours after birth." "To where?" Annie asked. "That's the problem. There's no receiving hospital." Claire looked at Annie. "So you were marked for transfer and never transferred?" "On paper, yes," Mercer said. Richard's voice hardened. "Who had authority to change those records?" "Several people could access them. Fewer could make them disappear." Mercer then placed a financial statement on the table. 1 week after the birth, Street Catherine's director received a consulting payment through a private medical advisory company. That company was connected to Harrington Family Holdings. Claire's face changed immediately. Her mother's maiden name was Harrington. Richard read the page twice. "Evelyn's family?" "Yes." Claire pushed her chair back slightly. "That doesn't prove she did anything." Mercer looked at her. "No. It proves money moved. The rest still needs evidence." Annie appreciated that he did not turn suspicion into certainty just because the pattern looked ugly. That evening, Evelyn came home earlier than usual. Annie was still at the townhouse because Claire had asked her to stay for dinner, though neither of them had eaten much. Evelyn entered the dining room and saw the copies Mercer had left behind. "What is all this?" Richard gathered the papers. "Old hospital records." Evelyn's eyes moved to Annie, then Claire. "You're still pursuing this?" Richard looked at her. "DNA confirmed Annie is my daughter. I know what the test said. And Claire's sister." Evelyn set her handbag on a chair. "Richard, I understand you're emotional, but dragging 18-year-old medical files through investigators is not going to give anyone peace." Annie felt Claire become more alert beside her. Richard asked, "Were you at Street Catherine's after I left that night?" Evelyn paused for only a second. "Yes." Claire turned toward her. Richard continued. "Why? Your father had been taken to another hospital. You were being pulled in 3 directions. Someone had to manage what was happening. What exactly were you managing?" Evelyn looked at him as though the question offended her. "A crisis." "What crisis?" "The entire situation with Naomi." Annie's hand stopped near her water glass. Richard's voice dropped. "What situation did Naomi create?" Evelyn realized too late how the sentence had sounded. She changed direction. "You were under enormous pressure. Your father was dying. The company was unstable. Naomi was upset. Nothing about that day was simple." Claire spoke before Richard could. "Did you know there were 2 babies?" Evelyn looked at her. "Of course I did." Annie felt something cold move through her chest. Claire asked, "Did you know one of them disappeared from the hospital?" Evelyn's expression sharpened. "That is not what happened." Annie spoke for the first time. "Then what happened?" Evelyn looked at her. "I don't think this conversation should include you." Richard answered immediately. "It includes her more than anyone." For the first time, Evelyn seemed to understand that Richard was no longer treating Annie as an unexpected problem outside the family. He was treating her as his daughter. Evelyn turned back to him. "Some doors were closed for a reason." Richard's face hardened. "By whom?" Evelyn did not answer. Later that night, Claire found Annie in the kitchen packing the hospital copies Mercer had given her. "You could stop," Claire said quietly. Annie looked at her. "Do you want to?" Claire shook her head. "Neither do I. What if what we find destroys everything?" Annie placed the papers into her bag. "Something already destroyed 18 years. I just want to know who did it." Claire nodded slowly. "Then we do this together." The next morning, Mercer called Richard from his car. "I found the name of the physician on duty that night, Dr. Samuel Pierce. Retired now, living in Westchester." Richard glanced toward Annie and Claire across the breakfast table. "Did you speak to him?" "I tried. And? I mentioned Street Catherine's. He stayed on the line. I mentioned October 16th. Still there." Mercer paused. "Then I said Baby Carter, Twin B." Richard waited. Mercer finished. He hung up. By noon, Daniel Mercer had arranged a meeting with Dr. Samuel Pierce for the following week. Richard wanted to push sooner, but Mercer refused. If he spent 18 years avoiding this, showing up at his house without warning won't make him cooperative, Mercer said. "Give me a few days." Richard disliked waiting. Annie could tell from the way he checked his phone every few minutes. But for once, money and influence could not force an answer to arrive faster. Claire seemed almost relieved by the pause. She texted Annie that afternoon. "Dinner?" Annie replied, "Depends where." Claire sent the name of a restaurant near Fifth Avenue. Annie searched it, saw the prices, and immediately wrote back, "Absolutely not." A minute later, Claire called. "You didn't even give it a chance." "I gave the menu a chance. Then I saw $38 chicken." "It's good chicken. For $38 it better know my birthday." Claire laughed. Annie heard it and smiled despite herself. "Fine," Claire said. "You pick." Annie chose a diner in Harlem, where Ruth used to take her after long shifts. The booths had red vinyl seats patched at the corners. The coffee came in thick ceramic mugs, and the same waitress had worked there since Annie was in middle school. When Claire walked in wearing a camel coat and carrying a handbag Annie recognized from a magazine, several people noticed. Claire noticed them noticing. "Do I look that out of place?" Annie slid a menu across the table. "You look like your coat has its own insurance policy." Claire looked down at herself. "This? How much was it?" "I don't know." "That answers my question." Claire laughed again and sat across from her. "You've gotten meaner since the DNA test." "No. You've gotten easier to make fun of." The waitress approached with a coffee pot. "Annie, honey, you eating actual food tonight, or pretending fries are a meal again?" "Actual food." "Good. Ruth would haunt me if I let you live on French fries." Annie smiled at the mention of her mother. "This is Claire." The waitress looked between them. "Friend from work?" Claire answered before Annie could. "Something like that." Annie met Claire's eyes. Neither of them had practiced saying sister yet. The waitress poured coffee. "Well, something like that. Make sure she eats." After she walked away, Claire said, "Everyone knows you here." Ruth knew half the neighborhood. The other half knew her. What did she do? Home health aide for years. Before that, she worked at Street Catherine's. Annie tore the paper wrapper from her straw. People trusted her. She remembered birthdays, doctor appointments, which neighbor needed groceries. She could be exhausted and still show up with soup. Claire lowered her eyes to the table. "I wish I could have met her." Annie looked at her more carefully. "Why?" "Because she raised my sister." The word landed between them. Annie stopped tearing the wrapper. Claire gave a small, uncertain smile. "Was that weird?" "A little." "Bad weird?" "No." Claire reached for her coffee. "Good." Their food came. Annie ordered a cheeseburger without pickles. Claire ordered the same thing and removed the pickles before taking the first bite. Annie noticed. Claire noticed her noticing. "What? You don't like pickles?" "No. Neither do I." "That's not exactly genetic evidence." "I know." A few minutes later, Claire pushed the tomato aside, too. Annie pointed at the plate. "Now you're doing it on purpose." "I hate tomatoes." "So do I." Claire narrowed her eyes. "This is getting annoying." By the end of dinner, they had collected a list neither of them intended to make. Both were left-handed. Both hated lavender-scented candles. Both listened to music while working. Both chewed the inside of their cheek when irritated. Both had a mild reaction to hazelnuts. Claire held up one finger. "I like jazz." "So, you listen to old soul music." "Ruth raised me." "That's not the same." "Close enough." Claire smiled. Finally, something different. After dinner, Annie took Claire upstairs to the apartment. Claire stopped just inside the doorway, not because the place was small, but because it felt lived in. Ruth's old radio remained on a shelf beside family photographs. A cast-iron skillet hung over the stove. A grocery list in Ruth's handwriting was still held to the refrigerator with a magnet from Coney Island. Claire moved toward the photographs. There was Annie in a school uniform, Annie at graduation, Annie holding a sewing kit at a community center, Annie beside Ruth in matching winter hats. Claire touched the edge of one frame. She took a lot of pictures. She said memory gets lazy. Claire looked at Ruth's face. She looks kind. She could also lecture for 20 minutes if you left wet towels on the bathroom floor. Claire smiled. Okay, that sounds familiar. Evain. She hates wet towels. For a moment, both of them laughed. Then Claire's expression changed. Annie saw why. Claire still loved Evelyn. Whatever Mercer found, whatever happened at Street, Catherine's, Evelyn, was still the woman who had sat beside Claire when she was sick, attended school events, corrected her posture, argued about curfews, and called too often whenever Claire traveled. Annie did not tell her what to feel. Instead, she asked, "Want coffee? You have coffee? I live in New York." Claire followed her into the kitchen. "Dad wants you to come over this weekend." "Why? Dinner? With Evelyn?" Claire hesitated. "Probably. That sounds terrible." "It might be." Strong sales pitch. Claire leaned against the counter while Annie filled the coffee maker. "He wants to help you with school, too." Annie stopped. Claire noticed immediately. "I knew I shouldn't have said it." "No, you shouldn't have. He's not trying to buy you." "I didn't say he was." "You're thinking it." Annie turned. Claire. 6 months ago, Ruth was still working part-time while getting treatment because she was worried about my tuition. She saved $20 here, $50 there. She bought fabric on sale so I could finish my portfolio. Now your father appears and suddenly he can write one check and make all of that look small. It wouldn't make it small. It would feel that way. Claire considered this before answering. "Then don't let him buy the dream." Annie frowned. "Let him show up for it." Annie said nothing. Claire continued. "If you get into school because of your portfolio, that's yours. If Dad helps with tuition later, that doesn't erase Ruth. It just means he finally does something a father should have done years ago." Annie turned back to the coffee maker. "You make him sound reasonable." "He isn't always." "That I believe." Claire smiled. Later, when Annie walked her downstairs, a black SUV waited at the curb. The driver stepped out, but Claire waved him back into the car. She looked toward Annie's building. "Next time. My place." Annie made a face. "Do I need formal wear?" "No." "Security clearance?" "Probably." They both laughed. Then Claire lifted her phone. A new message had arrived from Richard. Mercer confirmed Dr. Pierce agreed to meet. Claire showed Annie. The laughter disappeared. Annie read the message twice. 3 days ago, they had been strangers divided by a dressing room mirror. Now they were sisters preparing to question a man who might know why one of them had been erased from the other's life. Claire slipped the phone back into her pocket. "Whatever he says, we hear it together." Annie nodded. Together. Richard did not invite Annie and Claire into his study this time. He asked them to meet him in the breakfast room on Saturday morning, where sunlight came through the tall windows and coffee sat untouched beside a folder Claire recognized from the safe. Annie noticed the photograph inside before Richard even opened it. Claire sat across from him. "You said there were things we needed to know before we speak to Dr. Pierce." Richard nodded. "There are." Annie folded her hands on the table. "Then start with Naomi." Richard looked at the photograph for a moment before answering. "I met her before Whitmore Group became my whole life." Claire gave him a skeptical look. "You say that like the company kidnapped you." "In some ways, I let it." Annie caught the distinction. He had stopped pretending everything had simply happened to him. Richard continued. "Naomi was working with a neighborhood arts program in Brooklyn. I was there because Whitmore Foundation had agreed to sponsor part of it. I showed up late, wearing a suit that cost more than it should have, and tried to act like I understood the program." "What did she say to you?" Annie asked. "She told me if I wanted to understand the place, I should stop talking to the donors and help carry folding tables." Claire smiled despite herself. "I like her already." "So did I." Richard's expression changed slightly as he continued. "She didn't know who I was at first. That mattered to me more than I understood then. Most people heard Whitmore before they heard Richard. Annie looked at the photograph again, and when she found out, she laughed. Claire raised an eyebrow. That was her reaction? She said, "That explains the shoes." Annie smiled for the first time that morning. Richard went on. "We spent months seeing each other whenever we could. Cheap diners, late walks, street fairs, music in small clubs. She made fun of my taste in coffee. I pretended not to care that she was usually right about me. Did your family know?" Claire asked. Eventually, the warmth left his face. My father was not subtle about his opinion. Annie's voice sharpened. Because Naomi was black, Richard did not avoid the question. That was part of it. But she also came from a working-class family. No connections, no money, no social value in the way my father measured people. Claire looked uncomfortable. What did he say? Richard took a moment before answering. He rarely used ugly language. He preferred respectable language. Reputation, stability, tradition, shareholders, public perception. Annie understood exactly what he meant, so he could say the same thing without saying it. Yes. Richard turned the coffee cup once between his fingers. Naomi recognized it immediately. She told me once, people don't always call prejudice prejudice. Sometimes they call it tradition. Annie repeated the line quietly. That sounds like her. You sound like her too. Annie looked up. Richard did not add anything else. Claire asked, where did Evelyn fit into all this? Richard's expression tightened. The Harrington family had financial ties to Whitmore Group. My father wanted a formal alliance. Evelyn and I had known each other socially. For years. You were engaged to her? Eventually. Annie's eyes narrowed. While you were still seeing Naomi? Yes. Claire looked at him with open disappointment. Richard accepted it. I told myself I was buying time. My father was sick. The company was under pressure. I kept thinking I could stabilize everything and then walk away. Annie said, people can waste a lot of years waiting for the right time. Richard nodded. I learned that too late. He reached for the photograph and turned it over. Written across the back in younger handwriting were the words Claire had already seen. 2 daughters. Twice the reason to become a better man. Annie read it again. Richard continued. When Naomi told me she was pregnant, I had already decided I was done letting my father make decisions for me. When we learned there were twins, that decision became final. Claire asked, did Evelyn know? Yes. What did you tell her? That after the birth, I was ending the engagement and leaving the arrangement between our families. Claire lowered her eyes. How did she take it? She asked if I was prepared to throw away everything. And what did you say? Richard looked at Annie, then Claire. I told her I was choosing my family. No one spoke for a few seconds. Annie broke the pause, and then October 16th happened. Richard nodded. Naomi delivered at Street Catherine's. I was there. I held both of you. Claire glanced at Annie. Richard looked toward the photograph. One of you had darker skin. One had lighter skin. Both had the same mark behind the left ear. Annie's hand moved instinctively toward her hair, then stopped. So you noticed it then? Yes. Claire asked. Which one was I? Richard gave a faint smile. You kept pulling one arm out of the blanket. Annie kept one fist tucked under her chin. Annie looked at him. You remember that? I remember more than I deserve to. The words took some of the anger out of her, though not all of it. Richard's voice lowered. A few hours later, I received a call. My father had suffered a major cardiac event and had been taken to another hospital. The board was contacting me. Lawyers were calling. Everyone said I needed to leave Street Catherine's for a few hours. You left Naomi there alone? Claire asked. I thought I was coming back before dinner. Annie's face tightened. But when you came back, everything had changed. Richard nodded. One baby was reported dead. Naomi was gone. Papers were waiting for me. Claire looked toward the folder. And Evelyn was there? Yes. Annie studied him carefully. Did you ever think the timing was too perfect? Richard's answer came without defense. I should have. Did you? Not enough. Claire pressed her lips together. That's hard to hear. I know. Annie looked at the man across from her, the billionaire who could move money, people, and entire companies with a phone call. For the first time, his wealth seemed less important than the one decision he had failed to make 18 years earlier. He had accepted a version of events because grief, duty, and family pressure made it easier to accept than to challenge. Richard looked at both women. Dr. Pierce may tell us what happened inside Street Catherine's after I left. Annie picked up the photograph and slid it carefully back into the folder. Then, let's make sure he tells us everything. Daniel Mercer arranged the meeting with Dr. Samuel Pierce at a small restaurant in Westchester rather than Pierce's home. He chose a booth near the back, away from the lunch crowd, and arrived 20 minutes early. Annie and Claire came with Richard, but Mercer asked Richard to wait at another table until Pierce agreed to speak. If he sees all three of you at once, he may walk out, Mercer said. Claire glanced toward her father. He already knows why we're here. Knowing and facing it are different things. Annie understood that better than she wanted to. Pierce arrived 10 minutes late. He was in his 70s, wearing a brown jacket and carrying an old leather briefcase. The moment he recognized Mercer, his pace slowed. I told you on the phone I don't remember much from that hospital. Mercer gestured toward the empty seat. Then this should be a short conversation. Pierce sat. Mercer did not begin with accusations. He placed a copy of the hospital identification band on the table. Baby Carter, Twin Bay, October 16. Pierce's hand paused near his coffee. Annie saw it. Mercer did too. You remember that code? Mercer said. Pierce looked toward Annie for the first time. His eyes moved briefly to her face, then to the papers. I remember the case. Claire shifted beside Annie. What case? Pierce hesitated. There were 2 deliveries recorded under the same maternal file. We know that, Annie said. What happened to the second one? Pierce rubbed one thumb along the edge of the table. You need to understand how hospitals worked then. Not everything was digital. Orders were written, transferred, entered later. People made mistakes. Mercer slid another document toward him. This isn't a mistake. The mortality ledger has no matching entry. Pierce did not touch the page. Mercer added the incomplete transfer record. And this transfer code has no receiving facility. Pierce looked toward the restaurant window. Annie's patience broke first. Dr. Pierce, I spent 18 years without knowing where I came from. I'm sitting across from someone who worked the exact night I disappeared from the records. Please don't tell me about paperwork. Pierce looked at her again. You're Annie. She felt the words hit harder than she expected. How do you know my name? Mercer's attention sharpened. Pierce realized what he had revealed. Claire spoke quietly. Nobody introduced her. Pierce lowered his eyes. I heard about the DNA results. From who? Richard asked from the next table. Mercer turned. Richard had clearly heard enough. Pierce looked toward him and immediately became more guarded. You shouldn't be here. Richard stood. I should have been here 18 years ago. Pierce closed his briefcase. This meeting is over. Annie reached across and placed the old hospital band in front of him. No. Pierce stopped. This was on me, Annie said. My adoptive mother kept it because everybody else acted like the record didn't matter. She kept one piece of evidence for 18 years. You can give me 5 minutes. Pierce looked at the faded plastic strip for a long time. Then he sat again. Mercer remained standing beside the booth. Start after Richard left Street Catherine's. Pierce's voice was lower now. There was confusion that evening. Mr. Whitmore's father had been taken to another hospital. Several people from the Whitmore family arrived. Lawyers, an assistant, a woman from the Harrington family. Claire's expression tightened. Evain? Pierce nodded once. Richard's jaw set. What did she do? I never saw her touch a medical chart. That's not what I asked. Pierce looked at Mercer instead. A hospital administrator came to the maternity floor. He said one of the infants would be moved to a private nursery under special instruction. Annie asked, which one? The lighter-skinned twin. Claire looked at Annie. Pierce continued. The second infant was moved toward the transfer section. I asked why. I was told another facility would receive her. But none did, Mercer said. No. You knew that? Not at first. Annie's voice tightened. When did you know? The next morning. Pierce removed his glasses and folded them on the table. I checked the transfer sheet. There was no receiving hospital. Then I saw a mortality entry being prepared under the same maternal file. Richard stepped closer. You knew the death record was false. Pierce's face hardened with shame. I knew something was wrong. That's not the same answer. No. Pierce looked at Annie. It isn't, Claire asked. Did you report it? I questioned the administrator. And? He told me it was a private family matter, and that the legal department had approved everything. Annie gave a short, humorless laugh. A person disappears from a hospital, and everybody calls it a family matter? Pierce did not defend himself. Mercer said, Who was the administrator? Martin Vale. Richard recognized the name. Street Catherine's executive director. Yes. Mercer took out another page. Vale received a consulting payment 7 days later through Harrington Medical Advisory. Pierce's face confirmed more than his words. You knew about that too? Annie asked. Years later. But you stayed quiet. Pierce looked at her. I had a career. A mortgage. A wife, recovering from surgery. I told myself. I didn't know enough to accuse anyone. Annie held his gaze. And that made it easier? No. His answer was immediate. It made it possible. The distinction disturbed her more. Pierce continued. There was one person who refused to let it go. Annie already knew the name before he said it. Ruth Bennett. Her throat tightened. Pierce nodded. She worked support shifts in that wing. She found the infant in the transfer area and kept asking for the receiving paperwork. When nobody could produce it, she called outside the chain of command. Claire asked, Child welfare? Yes. Annie looked down at the hospital band. Ruth had not simply found her. Ruth had challenged the system that was trying to erase her. Pierce said, I told Ruth to let administration handle it. Annie's eyes lifted. You told her to stop? Yes. Did she? Pierce almost smiled, though regret kept it from becoming one. No. That sounded exactly like Ruth. Mercer asked, What happened after she reported it? Protective Services became involved. By then, the medical file had already been altered. No one could establish where the infant was supposed to go. So, temporary custody was arranged. Richard's face changed. And Naomi? Pierce looked at him. I never saw her after that night. Mercer closed the folder. One more question. Did Evelyn Harrington give Martin Vale instructions? Pierce hesitated. I never heard the conversation. Did you see them together? Yes. When? Before the transfer order appeared. Claire's eyes lowered. Pierce added, and later that evening, after the second file had been changed. No one rushed to fill the pause. Mercer gathered the documents and stood. I'll need a signed statement. Pierce looked toward Annie. I should have spoken years ago. Annie placed the hospital band back into its envelope. Yes, she said. You should have. Outside the restaurant, Claire walked beside Annie toward the parking lot. My mother was there. Annie did not correct the word. She raised you. Claire pressed one hand against her coat pocket. That doesn't tell me what she did. No. But it means she knew. Annie nodded. Behind them, Mercer's phone rang. He answered, listened for less than a minute, then called Richard over. I found another financial record. Richard turned. Mercer continued. Martin Vale wasn't the only person paid after October 16th. Claire stopped walking. Who else? Mercer looked directly at Richard, the attorney who prepared Naomi Carter's custody papers. Mercer did not wait until they reached Richard's car. He opened the financial record on his tablet and showed them a payment made through the same Harrington-linked advisory company that had paid Martin Vale. The recipient was Stephen Kessler, an attorney who had handled family and estate work for Street Catherine's private clients 18 years earlier. Richard read the amount. That's not a legal fee. Mercer shook his head. Not for anything I can find in the billing records. Claire looked between them. And he prepared the custody papers involving Naomi? Yes. Can we speak to him? I'm trying. Annie stood a few steps away with Ruth's old hospital band inside her coat pocket. Every answer seemed to open another question, but one thing had become harder to deny. The paperwork around her birth had not simply been messy. Someone had paid people who controlled the records. Her phone buzzed. She expected a message from work. Instead, a headline filled the screen. Teen event worker claims secret connection to billionaire Richard Whitmore. Annie opened it before anyone could stop her. The article used a photograph taken from her public social media account. It mentioned the fashion event, her temporary job, Ruth's death, the neighborhood where she lived, and the recent DNA test without saying where the information came from. Then came the part that made her grip the phone tighter. The article suggested Annie might be preparing to seek a substantial financial arrangement from Richard. Claire moved beside her. What is it? Annie handed her the phone. Claire's face hardened as she read. This is disgusting. Richard took the phone next. He read the first few paragraphs and immediately called someone. Annie heard him say, "Find out who gave them the DNA information." She reached for the phone. "That's not the main problem." Richard ended the call. "Someone released private information about you, and now everyone reading it thinks I came after you for money. They don't know the facts. They don't need facts. They have a headline." Mercer asked, "Is your address in there?" "Not the exact building." "Good. Don't respond publicly yet." Annie gave him a tired look. "So the advice is to do nothing while strangers explain my life for me. The advice is to know who's driving the story before you help them drive it farther." Claire handed Annie her own phone. Comments were already spreading beneath reposted versions of the story. Some called her a scammer. Others questioned why a young black woman working an event would suddenly claim a connection to a white billionaire family. A few said she had obviously planned the whole thing. Annie stopped reading. Claire locked the screen. "I'm sorry. For what?" "For showing you. I would have seen it anyway," Richard said. "My lawyers can issue a statement." Annie looked at him. "Saying what?" "That the DNA results are legitimate." "And then what happens? The entire city knows before I've even figured out what this means?" Richard paused. Annie continued. "A week ago I was working shifts and worrying about tuition. Now my face is online next to your net worth." Claire stepped closer. "She's right." Richard looked at both of them. "Then tell me what you want me to do." Annie almost answered with anger, but she stopped herself. The question sounded genuine. "Don't fix me." "I'm not trying to." "Yes, you are. Apartment, security, lawyers, school, money. Every time something happens, you reach for something expensive." Richard absorbed that without interrupting. "I need the truth protected," Annie said. "Not me packaged into something your public relations team can manage." Richard lowered his phone. "All right." "Really?" "Yes." Annie had expected resistance. "That was easier than I thought." "I'm learning," Claire said, slowly. Richard gave her a brief look. Apparently, by the next morning, the story had spread farther. Annie arrived at the coffee shop where she worked several weekday shifts and found the manager waiting near the register. His expression told her before he spoke. "Can we talk?" Annie untied her scarf. "Sure." He led her toward the supply area, though the door remained open. "I saw the article." "So did I. I'm not saying I believe it. That usually means something bad comes next." He looked uncomfortable. "A couple of customers asked whether reporters were going to show up." "They aren't." "I know, but the owner doesn't want attention around the shop." Annie understood. Not fired, not punished, just removed in language polite enough to protect everyone except her. "So what are you saying?" "We're taking you off the schedule for now." "For now? Just until things settle?" Annie nodded once. "Got it." "Annie, I'm sorry." She folded her apron carefully and placed it on the counter. Ruth used to say people can do something unfair and still find a polite way to say it. The manager lowered his eyes. Annie picked up her bag and left. Outside, she called Claire. "I lost one of my jobs." "What?" "Not technically. I'm just off the schedule until my existence becomes less inconvenient." Claire's anger came through immediately. "I'm calling Dad." "No." "Why not?" "Because I don't want him buying the coffee shop." Despite herself, Claire laughed once. "He probably would." "I know. That's why I'm serious." Later that afternoon, Annie met Richard and Mercer at a small conference office Mercer used near Grand Central. Claire arrived a few minutes after them. Richard placed his phone on the table. The article came from a freelance publicist who has done work for Harrington Family Charities. Claire closed her eyes briefly. "Evain? We don't have proof she authorized it," Mercer said. "But it points in her direction," Annie replied. "It points near her. That's not the same thing." Richard looked at Annie. "I can make a public statement tonight confirming the DNA and telling the press to leave you alone." She shook her head. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because they'll say I got exactly what I wanted. The billionaire publicly claimed me. Now the money comes next." Richard's jaw tightened. "People will say something no matter what we do." "I know." Annie leaned forward. "So stop trying to control what they say. Find out what happened at Street Catherine's." Richard looked at her for several seconds, then nodded. "Protect the truth," he said. Annie recognized her own words. "Yes." Mercer opened another file. "Then we have something useful." He placed 3 scanned envelopes on the table. Claire frowned. "What are those?" Letters, all addressed to Richard Whitmore, all written after October 16th. None appear in Whitmore's personal archive. Richard looked at the handwriting. His face changed. Naomi. Mercer nodded. The first one was mailed from New York, the second from Philadelphia, the third from Baltimore. Richard picked up the first scanned page. Annie watched his eyes move across the opening line. Richard, I don't understand why you're doing this, but I won't stop loving our daughter. His hand stopped. Claire read over his shoulder. She didn't disappear. No, Annie said. Mercer turned to the last envelope. And according to this return address, 18 years ago Naomi Carter was living in Baltimore. Richard looked up. Mercer continued. I'm checking whether that address leads to her now. For the first time since the article appeared, Annie forgot the comments, the lost shift, and the strangers judging her name online. Somewhere beyond the paperwork, beyond Evelyn, beyond Richard's mistakes, there might still be one person who could answer the question Annie had carried longest. Not who her father was, why her mother never came back. Mercer called Richard at 7:12 the next morning. I found her. Richard was already awake, standing at his kitchen counter with the first of Naomi's letters open beside him. Where? Baltimore. Same last name. Same date of birth. She's been there for years. Richard closed his eyes for a moment. Are you sure? I don't call people at 7 in the morning with guesses. What does she do? She works with a non-profit that helps women rebuild after housing loss and family crises. Richard looked down at Naomi's handwriting. Does she know you found her? No. Richard reached for his jacket. Mercer stopped him before he could speak. Don't show up with lawyers. I wasn't planning to. No security team either. I said I wasn't planning to. You're Richard Whitmore. Your definition of going alone sometimes includes 3 cars. Richard almost smiled, but couldn't. I'm driving myself. Mercer gave him the address. Annie learned about it 20 minutes later. Richard called before leaving New York. I know where Naomi is. Annie sat at Ruth's kitchen table with a mug of coffee between her hands. Alive? Yes. The word hit harder than she expected. Where? Baltimore. Annie looked toward the old photograph of Ruth on the refrigerator. Are you going? Yes. When? Now. Annie's first instinct was to say she was coming. Instead, she stopped. Does she know about me? No. Richard's answer settled the decision. Then go alone. He sounded surprised. You're sure? No. But if she thinks I died, I don't want the first thing she sees to be me standing on her sidewalk while she's trying to understand what happened. Richard said nothing for a moment. Annie continued, tell her the truth. Don't soften it because you think it'll protect her. I won't. And don't make this about forgiving you. His voice lowered. I know. Annie looked at the hospital band lying beside her coffee. No. You're starting to know. Richard accepted that. I'll call you. Only after she knows. He promised. The drive to Baltimore took Richard a little over 3 hours. For most of it, he kept the radio off. Mercer had sent him a recent photograph from the nonprofit's public website, but Richard refused to open it again. He wanted to see Naomi as she was now, not study her first through a screen. The address led to a narrow brick row house on a residential street west of downtown. There was a small planter near the steps and a wind chime hanging beside the porch light. Nothing about the house suggested the life Richard had once imagined for Naomi, and that realization brought no comfort. He stood at the door longer than he intended before knocking. Footsteps approached from inside. The door opened. Naomi Carter looked at him. Time had changed her, but not enough to hide the woman he remembered. There was silver beginning near her temples and fine lines around her eyes. She wore dark jeans, a navy sweater, and reading glasses pushed on top of her head. Her hand remained on the doorknob. Richard. He had rehearsed half a dozen openings during the drive. All of them disappeared. Naomi. Her expression tightened. What are you doing here? I need to talk to you. No. She began to close the door. Naomi, I found our daughter. The door stopped. She did not reopen it fully. Claire? Richard swallowed. No. Naomi's face changed. He took the DNA report from the folder under his arm. The other one. For several seconds, Naomi did not move. Then she opened the door wider. What did you say? The daughter we were told died. Naomi's eyes dropped to the paper in his hand, then returned to his face. No. Richard held out the report. She's alive. Naomi did not take it. No. She's 18. Her name is Annie Carter. At the name Carter, Naomi's fingers tightened around the edge of the door. Who told you that? DNA did. Richard placed the report on the small table just inside the entryway because she still would not take it. Annie and Claire were tested. They're full sisters. I was tested too. Naomi looked down at the page. Richard watched her read the first lines, then the names. Annie Carter, Claire Whitmore, Richard Whitmore. Naomi pressed one hand against the wall. Richard moved instinctively, but she lifted her other hand. Don't. He stopped. She looked again at the result. She's alive? Yes. My baby is alive? Yes. Naomi covered her mouth. The sound that came from her was not a cry at first. It was smaller, almost like the body refusing to let 18 years of grief move all at once. Then the tears came. Richard remained where he was. Naomi picked up the report and read it again as though the words might change. Where is she? New York. Is she okay? She's strong. Naomi looked sharply at him. That wasn't what I asked. Richard lowered his eyes. She grew up with a woman named Ruth Bennett. Ruth worked at Street Catherine's. She found Annie after the hospital records had been altered. Annie entered foster care, and Ruth later adopted her. Naomi pressed the report against her chest. She was alone? No. Ruth loved her. Naomi closed her eyes. Thank God. Richard waited. When Naomi looked at him again, grief had turned into anger. You knew about this? I learned the truth days ago. Not that. 18 years ago. I was told she died. So was I. Richard's head lifted. Naomi's voice sharpened. They told me one daughter died. They told me you took Claire. Richard felt the meaning before he answered. I was told you left. I didn't leave. I know that now. No, Richard, you know part of it now. She moved away from the doorway and placed the report on a side table. I signed nothing. Richard's face tightened. Naomi continued. They showed me papers with your name on them. They said you had taken Claire, and that if I fought for custody, Whitmore attorneys would bury me in court. Evain? Naomi's expression changed immediately. So you know. Not enough. She came to the hospital. Richard said nothing. She told me you had made your choice. Your family. Your name. One daughter. Richard's voice dropped. I never said that. I know that now. The words cut because she used his own phrase against him. Naomi looked toward the report again. I wrote to you. I found the letters. After 18 years. Yes. You had money, Richard. He did not defend himself. I know. I had grief, hospital bills, and people telling me every official document said I had no case. Don't stand on my doorstep and act like we lost the same fight. We didn't. That answer seemed to stop her more than an excuse would have. Richard continued. I should have looked harder. I should have questioned everything. I didn't. Naomi wiped her face with the heel of her hand. Does Annie know about me? She knows your name. She's seen the photograph from the hospital. Naomi's eyes filled again. The one with both girls? Yes. What did she say? Richard thought of Annie holding the photograph as though it were proof that her life had begun with love. She said, she held me. Naomi turned away. For several seconds, Richard heard only the faint sound of traffic from the street. When she faced him again, her voice was barely steady. Does she want to meet me? Richard answered carefully. She wants the truth. Naomi nodded once. That sounds fair. Will you meet her? Naomi looked down at Annie's name on the DNA report. If she'll let me. Annie did not answer Richard's call right away. She let the phone ring twice before picking it up, partly because she already knew what he was going to say and partly because she was afraid of how much she wanted to hear it. She agreed to meet you, Richard said. Annie sat at Ruth's kitchen table with the hospital band beside her. Did she ask about me? Yes. What did she ask? Richard paused. If you were okay. If you wanted to meet her. She asked what you said when you saw the hospital photograph. Annie looked toward the window. What did you tell her? That you said, she held me. Annie closed her eyes briefly. You told her that? Yes. What did she say? She cried. The answer landed differently than Annie expected. She had spent most of her life treating her biological mother as an unanswered question. Questions did not cry. Questions did not live in Baltimore, work at a nonprofit, or keep old grief inside a row house. When? Annie asked. Whenever you're ready. Annie stared at the ring Ruth had worn for almost 30 years, now resting in a small dish near the sugar bowl. Tomorrow. Richard seemed surprised. Tomorrow? If I wait a week, I'll spend a week inventing reasons not to go. I can drive you. No. Annie, I need to do this without arriving in one of your cars. Richard did not argue. All right, Claire called 10 minutes later. I'm going with you. Annie leaned back in the chair. You didn't ask. I know. That usually bothers me. Does it bother you now? Annie thought about it. Not as much. Claire arrived early the next morning in jeans, a plain sweater, and shoes that looked deliberately less expensive than usual. Annie noticed but chose not to comment. They took the train south. For the first hour, they barely talked about Naomi. Claire read messages on her phone. Annie watched the landscape change outside the window. Somewhere after Philadelphia, Claire put her phone away. What are you going to call her? Annie frowned. What do you mean? When we get there? Naomi. Claire nodded. That makes sense. What are you going to call her? Claire looked toward the passing trees. I don't know. Annie understood. Claire had called Evelyn Mom her entire life. Biology could change a fact in a laboratory report, but it could not rearrange language overnight. When they reached Baltimore, Claire ordered a rideshare. Naomi's street looked exactly as Annie had imagined from Richard's description. Brick row houses, narrow steps, small front gardens, cars parked close along the curb. Annie stopped at the bottom of Naomi's steps. Claire stayed beside her. You don't have to come in with me, Annie said. I know. I think I need to go first. Claire nodded. Text me when you want me. Annie climbed the steps before she could reconsider. Naomi opened the door almost immediately. Neither woman spoke. Annie had seen Naomi in the hospital photograph, but the photograph had prepared her only for resemblance, not recognition. Naomi's eyes were the first thing Annie noticed. Then the shape of her hands. Even the way she pressed her lips together seemed familiar. Naomi's fingers tightened around the edge of the door. Annie. Hearing her own name in that voice made Annie's throat tighten. Hey. Naomi stepped back. Come in. The house smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon. A folded blanket rested over the sofa. Books and community newsletters covered a small side table. Nothing had been staged for the meeting except 2 mugs sitting on the dining table. Naomi gestured toward them. I made coffee. Then I thought maybe you don't drink coffee. I do. Good. They sat across from each other. For several seconds, both reached for their mugs without drinking. Naomi spoke first. I don't know what you've been told. Enough to know everybody had a different version. That sounds about right. Annie looked at her. Did you look for me? Naomi did not pretend to misunderstand. I thought you were dead. Annie lowered her eyes. They brought me paperwork, Naomi continued. They told me one of you had died. I asked to see you. They said there had already been arrangements. What arrangements? I never got a clear answer. Every time I asked another question, someone gave me another form. Annie's fingers tightened around the mug. And Claire? I tried to get her back. For how long? Naomi's expression changed. Longer than people believed I should. Not as long as I wish I had. Annie looked up. Naomi continued. I found legal aid. I wrote letters. I called offices. I went back to the hospital. I was told the paperwork was final. I was told Richard had powerful attorneys. I was told I could spend years fighting and still lose. So you stopped? Yes. The honesty hurt more than an excuse would have. Naomi did not look away. I was scared. I was exhausted. I had almost no money left. And every official document told me the same thing. I should have kept fighting anyway. Annie swallowed. You were alone. I was. That doesn't make it okay. No. Annie studied her face. You're not going to tell me you did your best? Naomi's eyes filled. No, because some days I did, some days I didn't. Some days I was strong enough to call another lawyer. Other days I stayed in bed and believed what they told me because getting up hurt too much. That answer broke through something Annie had been holding. She looked down at her hands. I had someone. Naomi nodded immediately. Ruth. Annie looked up. Richard told you? Only that she raised you. She did more than that. Tell me. So Annie did. She told Naomi about Ruth packing lunch before dawn, working through knee pain, sitting through school meetings, saving for fabric, teaching Annie to hem a skirt properly, leaving soup for neighbors. and refusing to let Annie think being adopted meant being unwanted. Naomi cried without interrupting. When Annie finished, Naomi said, "Then I owe a woman I never met everything." Annie's voice softened. She would have hated hearing that. Naomi almost smiled. Why? She'd say nobody owes anybody for loving family. The smile stayed for a moment. Then Naomi asked, "Can I see a picture of her?" Annie opened her phone and showed her one from graduation. Ruth stood beside Annie, wearing a blue dress and a crooked corsage. Naomi touched the edge of the phone, careful not to cover Ruth's face. "She looks proud." She was. She should have been. Annie felt tears reach her eyes, but she let them stay. After a while, she sent Claire a message. "Come in." Claire entered a few minutes later. Naomi rose when she saw her. Claire stopped near the doorway. For a second, Annie could almost see the two different lives pulling Claire in opposite directions. Naomi spoke first. "Hi, Claire." Claire's eyes filled. "Hi." Neither moved closer. Claire looked at Annie once, then back at Naomi. "I don't know what I'm supposed to call you." Naomi nodded. "You don't have to decide that today." Claire swallowed. "I still love Evelyn. I know, after everything she may have done." Naomi's expression did not harden. "She raised you." Claire's voice shook. "Does that make me terrible?" "No." Naomi took a small step closer but stopped before entering Claire's space. "Love doesn't become false just because someone did something wrong, but love also doesn't require you to protect what they did." Claire wiped her cheek. Naomi added, "You don't owe guilt for choices adults made before you had any say in them." That was when Claire finally moved forward, not into Naomi's arms, just close enough to sit beside her. Annie watched them from across the table and realized there was no clean way to rebuild what had been broken. No single embrace could erase 18 years, and no DNA result could tell them how to become family. When Annie stood to leave later that afternoon, Naomi walked her to the door. "Can I ask you something?" Naomi said. Annie turned. "Can I hug you?" The question mattered. Annie nodded. Naomi wrapped her arms around her carefully, as though she understood that love arriving late still had to ask permission. Annie did not call her mom. Not yet, but she did not pull away either. And when she and Claire stepped back onto the Baltimore sidewalk, Annie knew the next question was no longer whether Naomi had wanted them. It was how many people had worked to make all three women believe otherwise. By the time Annie and Claire returned to New York, Evelyn had already moved. Richard learned about it before noon. 3 members of the Whitmore Group Board had requested an emergency session, formally citing leadership instability, reputational exposure, and potential conflicts affecting shareholder confidence. Daniel Mercer read the notice once and placed it on the conference table. "She's not trying to defend herself anymore," he said. "She's trying to separate you from the company before you can use the company's platform against her." Richard folded the notice. "She thinks the board can frighten me." Mercer looked at him. "The board doesn't need to frighten you. It only needs to convince itself that saving the Whitmore name matters more than saving your position." Annie sat near the end of the table with Claire beside her. Less than 24 hours earlier, she had been drinking coffee in Naomi's Baltimore home. Now she was listening to executives discuss control of a corporation worth billions, as though the question of who had taken 18 years from her life were another line on a balance sheet. Claire looked at her father. "Can they remove you?" "Temporarily, yes. Permanently, if enough directors vote for it." "And Evelyn can make that happen?" "She can try." Annie noticed Richard did not sound offended by the idea of losing the company. That was new. Mercer opened another folder. "We have something more important than the board meeting." Dr. Pierce signed his statement this morning. Richard looked up. "He confirms the transfer record was irregular, that Martin Vale personally intervened, and that Evelyn Harrington was present before and after the record changes." Claire pressed her lips together. Mercer continued. "I also verified the consulting payments to Vale and Stephen Kessler. Kessler is still alive. His attorney called me last night." "What did he say?" Annie asked. "He's willing to cooperate if he receives formal protection regarding his own exposure." Annie gave a humorless smile. "People get very honest when they think the truth is coming anyway." Mercer glanced at her. "That has been my experience." Annie's phone vibrated. The number was unfamiliar. She almost ignored it, then answered. "Annie Carter?" "Yes. My name is David Levin. I represent Mrs. Evelyn Whitmore in a private matter. I'd like to discuss an offer that may resolve the current situation without further public damage." Annie looked across the table at Claire. An offer? A confidential settlement? Richard's expression changed when he heard the phrase. Annie stood and walked toward the window. What kind of settlement? I'd prefer to discuss the details in person. Why? Because the proposal is substantial. Annie understood immediately. How substantial? The lawyer paused. Enough to guarantee your education, housing, long-term financial security, and complete independence. Richard stood. Annie raised one hand toward him without turning around. What does Evelyn want? A mutual non-disclosure agreement. No further public claims concerning Mrs. Whitmore, Street Catherines, or events surrounding your birth. You would remain free to maintain whatever private relationship you choose with Mr. Whitmore. Annie looked through the window at midtown traffic below. So I can have a father as long as I don't talk about how I lost him. I wouldn't characterize it that way. I would. The lawyer's voice stayed professional. Miss Carter, I understand this is emotional. No. You understand there's a number on a piece of paper. Then perhaps you should see the number before making a decision. Annie almost said no. Then Ruth came to mind. Not as a speech or a memory from long ago, but as facts Annie lived with every day. Medicine cut carefully because insurance had not covered enough. Envelopes marked rent. Utility bills paid 2 days late. Fabric purchased from clearance bins so Annie could finish her portfolio. She said, "Send it." The agreement arrived 10 minutes later. Claire read the number first. Her eyes widened. Annie? Richard took the document but did not comment. The trust offered enough money to change Annie's life several times over. Tuition, anywhere. An apartment. Investments. Medical coverage. Financial security Ruth had never experienced. Annie sat down again. For several minutes, she said nothing. Claire touched her arm. Whatever you decide, I'm not judging you. Annie looked at her. You mean that? Yes. Richard spoke next. So do I. Annie turned toward him. Even if I take it? His answer took a moment. I would hate what it represents, but I won't tell you what 18 years of loss is worth. That surprised her more than the offer itself. Mercer remained by the folder of evidence. Just understand what the agreement does. It doesn't only stop you from speaking about Evelyn. It weakens any civil action tied to the hospital records and gives her a powerful argument that the matter was privately resolved. Annie read the first page again, then the second. At the bottom was a line for her signature. She imagined how easy it would be to sign. No more worrying about tuition. No more lost shifts. No more calculating groceries. No more wondering whether rent would rise. Then she remembered standing in Ruth's apartment after losing her coffee shop hours because strangers had decided money must be the reason she existed in Richard Whitmore's life. Annie picked up her phone and called David Levin back. He answered quickly. Miss Carter, I read it. I'm glad. I think you'll agree Mrs. Whitmore is making a serious effort to provide you with security. She's buying silence. That is not the language used in the agreement. It's still what the agreement does. Before you reject something significant, I would encourage you to speak with independent counsel. I will. There was a brief pause. Then Annie added, but you can tell Evelyn something for me. I'm listening. 18 years ago, she paid people to stay quiet. She must think everyone has a price. Miss Carter, she was wrong about Ruth. She was wrong about Naomi. Annie looked at Claire, and she's wrong about me. She ended the call. Richard did not congratulate her. Annie appreciated that. Refusing millions was not a heroic gesture to her. It was terrifying. Claire asked, Are you okay? No. That made Claire smile faintly. At least you're consistent. Annie returned the smile. Mercer closed the settlement file and opened another. Then we move. Richard looked at him. What's left? The final financial chain. We have the Vail payment, Kessler's cooperation, Pierce's statement, Naomi's letters, and the altered transfer records. I also recovered internal correspondence from Harrington Medical Advisory. He slid a printed email across the table. Richard read it first. Claire read over his shoulder. Annie watched both their expressions change. The email referred to Naomi as a black, unmarried mother, whose public association with the Whitmore family could create inheritance complications and reputational risk. Claire pushed the page away as though touching it had become difficult. She actually wrote this? The account traces back to Evelyn's private office, Mercer said. Richard folded the page carefully. Enough. Mercer nodded. Enough for what? Richard looked at Annie, then Claire. To stop answering this behind closed doors. By late afternoon, Whitmore Group's communications office received a direct order from Richard. Schedule a press conference for the following morning at headquarters. No pre-written statement from the board. No questions screened in advance. Claire looked at him. What if they vote you out before then? Richard picked up the board notice and tore it once down the middle. I spent 18 years protecting the wrong things. Annie watched him place the pieces on the table. The next morning, cameras began gathering in the lobby before 9. Most reporters believed Richard Whitmore was preparing to deny a scandal. None of them knew he was about to confirm the part that mattered most. By 9:15, the lobby of Whitmore Group no longer looked like a corporate headquarters. Camera crews occupied the front rows. Financial reporters stood beside entertainment correspondents, and producers spoke into headsets while employees slowed near the elevators to see what was happening. The board had prepared a statement for Richard, 3 pages designed to reassure investors and distance the company from what its lawyers called unverified personal allegations. Richard read the first paragraph once, folded the pages, and set them aside. Annie noticed. She stood near Claire at the side of the stage wearing a dark blazer she had altered herself the night before. Richard's communications director had offered to send a stylist. Annie declined. She had spent enough of her life being told what version of herself made other people comfortable. Claire glanced toward her. You okay? No. Good, me neither. Annie almost smiled. That's becoming our thing. Across the aisle, Naomi sat near Daniel Mercer. She had agreed to attend only after Richard promised she would not be used as decoration for his apology. Evelyn had arrived 10 minutes earlier with her attorney and taken a seat in the second row. She wore cream, spoke to no one, and kept her attention on the stage. At exactly 9:30, Richard approached the microphones. Questions began before he reached the podium. Mr. Whitmore, is the DNA report authentic? Did you secretly father another daughter? Is Whitmore Group paying Annie Carter a settlement? Has the board asked you to resign? Richard lifted one hand. The questions continued for another few seconds before reporters lowered their voices enough for him to begin. For 18 years, the public has known me as the father of one daughter. He looked toward Claire, then toward Annie. The truth is, I have 2. Camera shutters accelerated. Several reporters began speaking at once, but Richard continued. Annie Carter is my biological daughter. Independent DNA testing established that with a probability greater than 99.99%. The same testing confirmed that Annie and Claire Whitmore are full biological sisters. They were born on the same day, at the same hospital, to the same mother. A reporter near the center called out, "Who is the mother?" Richard's eyes moved toward Naomi. Naomi Carter. The reaction spread through the room. Evelyn's attorney leaned toward her. But she did not turn. Richard continued. Before anyone repeats the claim that Annie approached me for money, understand this clearly. She did not come looking for my wealth. She was working a temporary shift at a fashion event when circumstances brought her and Claire together. Annie felt every camera angle toward her. Richard's next words came without hesitation. She did not fail to find me. I failed to find her. The sentence changed the tone in the room more than the DNA result had. Richard rested both hands on the podium. 18 years ago, I was told that one of my twin daughters died shortly after birth. I was also told that Naomi Carter voluntarily relinquished her rights regarding Claire and chose not to remain in contact with me. Naomi lowered her eyes. I believe those documents. I should not have. Annie saw Richard pause, not because he had forgotten what to say, but because the next part required him to stop hiding behind the fact that he had been deceived. I had resources Naomi did not have. I had money, lawyers, investigators, access. I accepted a version of events because grief, family pressure, and business obligations gave me reasons to stop asking questions. Those reasons do not erase my responsibility. Claire's expression softened, but only slightly. A business reporter called out, "Are you saying the records were falsified?" Richard looked toward Mercer. An independent investigation uncovered serious irregularities in medical and custody records connected to Street Catherine's private hospital. Those findings include an incomplete neonatal file, a death record without proper authentication, a transfer code with no receiving hospital, payments to individuals involved in the records, and custody documents Naomi Carter says she never signed. Another reporter asked, "Who made those payments?" Richard answered carefully. Financial records trace payments through entities connected to Harrington Family Holdings. The room changed again. This time every camera turned toward Evelyn. Her attorney stood halfway. Mr. Whitmore, I strongly advise against making unsupported insinuations about my client. Richard did not raise his voice. I am not asking the press to convict anyone. The evidence has been provided to appropriate counsel and authorities for review. The attorney replied, then perhaps you should stop trying the matter in public. Richard looked directly at him. The matter was hidden in private for 18 years. I am correcting the public record. Annie heard Claire exhale beside her. A reporter shouted, Mrs. Whitmore, did you know Annie Carter existed? Evelyn did not answer. Another voice followed. Did you know Naomi Carter was Claire's biological mother? Evelyn's attorney stepped in front of her. No questions. Claire moved before Annie expected her to. She walked toward the microphones. Richard turned. Claire? She held out her hand. He stepped aside. Claire looked at the press, then at Evelyn. My mother raised me for 18 years. The word mother made Evelyn's face shift. Claire continued. That part of my life is real. So is what I know now. Loving someone does not mean protecting every choice they made. A reporter asked, do you believe Evelyn Whitmore was involved? Claire looked toward Annie before answering. I believe my sister deserved 18 years of truth. Annie felt her throat tighten. Claire added, and so did Naomi. So did my father. So did I. Evelyn finally rose. Enough. Every microphone caught it. Claire turned toward her. Evelyn walked toward the front row. You have no idea what this family was facing 18 years ago. Richard stepped away from the podium. Then tell us. Evelyn looked at him. Your father was dying. The company was unstable. The board was ready to tear the Whitmore name apart. You were preparing to throw away everything. Richard's expression hardened. For Naomi? For a life you didn't understand. Naomi stood. Evelyn saw her and stopped. Naomi did not move toward the stage. She simply said, you mean a life you decided wasn't acceptable? Evelyn's face tightened. The cameras turned toward both women. Annie knew the press conference had just crossed into something no prepared statement could contain. Richard had begun the morning intending to acknowledge a daughter. Now the woman who had spent 18 years controlling the story had decided to speak for herself. Evelyn remained standing near the second row while cameras shifted toward her. For years, she had known how to enter a public event, where to place her hands, when to smile, and how long to hold a reporter's attention. None of those habits helped her now. Naomi faced her from several feet away. You said Richard was throwing everything away, Naomi said. What exactly did that mean? Evelyn looked toward the reporters, then toward Richard. It meant he was prepared to destroy a company employing thousands of people because he was angry with his father. Richard's voice hardened. I was leaving an arrangement I never wanted. You were abandoning responsibility. For my daughters? For a decision you were making without understanding the consequences. Annie heard the word consequences and felt something inside her tighten. For Evelyn, almost every choice seemed to have been measured in names, money, boards, and public appearance. Annie had spent her life measuring different things, whether rent cleared, whether Ruth's prescription could wait until payday, whether there was enough fabric left to finish a portfolio piece. She stepped closer. What consequence did I represent? Evelyn turned toward her. This is more complicated than you think. Then make it simple. Richard glanced at Annie but did not interrupt. Annie continued, Did you know my mother had twins? Yes. Did you know one baby was moved out of the nursery? Evelyn's attorney stepped forward. My client is not answering questions that may relate to an active legal investigation. Evelyn lifted one hand without looking at him. No. The attorney stopped. Evelyn looked at Annie. I knew arrangements were made. What arrangements? To stabilize a situation that was becoming impossible. Claire's face changed. You're still talking like this was a board meeting. Evelyn turned toward her. Claire, you were raised safely. You had every opportunity, every resource. And Annie didn't. That was never the intention. Annie gave a short laugh. You think intention changes the result? Evelyn's jaw tightened. Claire stepped forward. Did you know she was sent into protective custody? No. Did you ever ask? Evelyn hesitated. That was enough. Claire looked away for a second, then back at her. You raised me. You packed my lunches when I was little. You waited outside school when I had a fever. You stayed up when I couldn't sleep before exams. I know that was real. Evelyn's eyes filled. It was. I believe you. For 1 second, relief appeared across Evelyn's face. Then Claire continued, but if you loved me, you should have loved me enough not to build my whole life on a lie. Evelyn's mouth parted, but nothing came. Claire wiped one cheek with the side of her hand. You didn't just take Annie away from me. You took away the chance for me to know who Naomi was. You took away Dad's chance to make his own decision. You decided for everybody. I protected this family. Annie spoke before Richard could. Which family? Evelyn looked at her. The family you took one daughter from? The question moved through the crowd faster than any accusation Richard had made from the podium. Evelyn's control finally cracked. You have no idea what the Whitmore family was then, Naomi answered. I knew exactly what it was. Evelyn turned toward her. You had nothing. Naomi's expression did not change. I had a job. I had a home. I had a life. You had no influence, no protection, no understanding of what Richard was expected to carry. Naomi took one step closer. I wasn't asking your permission to be their mother. You would never have been accepted. There it is. Evelyn froze. Naomi continued. For 18 years, you dressed it up as reputation, responsibility, tradition, business risk. But that was always underneath it, wasn't it? Evelyn looked toward the cameras. Naomi did not let her escape into public language again. You thought a black woman without your family name was beneath the future you wanted for Richard. I never said that. You didn't have to. Annie moved beside Naomi. Evelyn looked at the two of them together. You had nothing, she repeated, but this time the sentence sounded weaker. Annie answered. She had us. Evelyn's eyes shifted to her. Annie continued. You were the one who needed everything else. Richard stepped away from the podium and approached Evelyn. He did not raise his voice. Did you authorize payments to Martinvale? Her attorney immediately said, Richard. Richard ignored him. Did you authorize Stephen Kessler to prepare custody papers Naomi never signed? Evelyn's expression hardened again. You have lawyers. Ask them. I'm asking my wife. You stopped treating me like your wife the day you told me you were leaving. Claire closed her eyes. Richard's face changed, but he kept his voice level. So this was punishment? No, it was survival. For who? Evelyn looked at him. For all of us. Richard shook his head. No. Survival would have meant telling the truth and letting me decide what came next. You would have chosen her. Yes. The answer landed without hesitation. Evelyn looked at Naomi. Richard continued. And our daughters. Evelyn's eyes moved toward Annie. Then Claire. What happens next? Richard said. Happens in daylight. Her attorney stepped closer. This discussion is over. Richard nodded toward Mercer. It is. Mercer had already been speaking quietly with two attorneys near the side entrance. He approached with a folder in hand. The documents have been forwarded to state investigators. Dr. Pierce's signed statement is included. Stephen Kessler's counsel has confirmed cooperation. Financial records from Harrington Medical Advisory are preserved. Evelyn's attorney looked at him sharply. Preserved by whom? Independent forensic review. Evelyn understood what that meant. Deleting files now would solve nothing. A reporter called out, Mrs. Whitmore, are you resigning from the foundation? Another asked whether prosecutors had been contacted. Richard raised one hand. There will be no more statements about potential charges today. Authorities will decide what is criminal. Not this company, and not the press. Annie appreciated that. She did not want revenge dressed up as justice. Outside the headquarters later, Mercer found her standing near the curb with Naomi and Claire. Annie asked, Does any of this actually make things fair? Mercer considered the question. Justice isn't always fair, Annie. Sometimes it arrives years late. After innocent people have already paid the bill. Then what's the point? Making sure the bill doesn't get passed to somebody else. Annie looked toward the building where reporters were still gathering. For the first time, Evelyn no longer controlled which version of the story survived. But Annie understood something else now. Exposing the truth was only the end of the lie. It was not yet the beginning of healing. 6 months later, Annie stood backstage at a student fashion showcase in Manhattan, with 3 safety pins between her lips and one sleeve still unfinished. Tell me you are not sewing that now, Claire said as she came around the garment rack. Annie removed the pins. I'm fixing it. You said that 20 minutes ago. It needed fixing 20 minutes ago, too. Claire looked down at the deep blue dress Annie had designed for herself. The fabric was simple, but the cut was precise, with a narrow embroidered teardrop near the collar that most people would miss unless they knew where to look. Claire touched the embroidery lightly. You kept it. I changed the size. I meant the symbol. Annie met her eyes. So did you. Claire smiled and tucked her hair behind her left ear. The birthmark was still there. 6 months earlier, that mark had turned an ordinary work shift into a question neither woman had been prepared to answer. Now it no longer frightened Annie. It had become one piece of a larger story, one that no longer depended on hospital records or anyone else's permission. A coordinator passed them and called, Annie Carter. 10 minutes. See? Claire said. 10 minutes. You're done sewing. I decide when I'm done sewing. You're impossible. You're wearing shoes that cost more than my sewing machine. Claire looked down. These were on sale. That does not help your case. They both laughed. On the makeup table beside Annie's brushes sat a framed photograph of Ruth. It had been taken at Annie's graduation. Ruth wore a blue dress, a crooked corsage, and the proud expression Annie remembered more clearly than any photograph could capture. Naomi entered backstage carrying 2 paper cups. I brought coffee. Annie accepted one. You're officially learning how to be useful at fashion shows. Naomi smiled. I raised money for community programs for 20 years. I know how to survive long events. Claire took the second cup. Naomi looked at Ruth's photograph. I still wish I could have met her. Annie adjusted the bracelet on her wrist. She would have asked if you'd eaten. I did. She wouldn't believe you. Naomi laughed softly. Then maybe we would have gotten along. Annie looked at the photograph. She would have liked you. Naomi's expression softened. But she did not ask how Annie knew. That was something Annie appreciated about the past 6 months. Naomi had never tried to replace Ruth. She had never demanded a title, never treated DNA as a shortcut through years they had not shared. They had coffee. They called. Naomi came to New York when Annie invited her, and Annie visited Baltimore twice. Sometimes Annie called her Naomi. Once, by accident, she had almost said Mom. Neither of them mentioned it. Claire looked toward the curtain. Dad and Naomi are sitting together. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Claire, what? You are. We have assigned seats. Next to each other. Your father requested that. Annie smiled. That sounds like him. Naomi shook her head, though she was smiling too. Richard had changed in quieter ways than Annie expected. After the press conference, he stepped away from several Whitmore Group responsibilities while independent investigations moved forward. Evelyn resigned from the foundation and was later formally charged alongside 2 former associates connected to the hospital records. Her lawyers continued to fight the case, and no one in the family pretended the legal process would be quick. Claire still spoke to Evelyn. Not often, not easily, but Annie never asked her to stop. Some losses were complicated enough without demanding hatred as proof of loyalty. Richard had offered to pay Annie's tuition after she received admission based on her portfolio. Annie initially refused. They argued for nearly an hour. Finally, Naomi had said, letting him make up for lost time isn't the same as handing him your future. Annie had accepted part of the help under one condition. Richard would never call the school, influence a professor, buy a sponsorship, or put the Whitmore name anywhere near Annie's work. Richard agreed. Then he asked to attend every showcase. Annie allowed that too. Claire picked up the dress. Turn around. What are you doing? Helping you. You know how? No. That's reassuring. Claire positioned herself behind Annie and carefully pulled the zipper upward. It caught halfway. Claire stopped. This is harder than it looked when you did it. Annie smiled. I tried telling you rich people that months ago. I was distracted. By your birthmark? By the woman accusing me of stealing hers. Annie laughed. I did not accuse you of stealing it. You sounded very suspicious. You were suspicious. Claire finally pulled the zipper into place. There. Annie faced the mirror. Claire stepped beside her. For a moment, neither woman said anything. Annie adjusted her hair. Then Claire reached over and moved it gently away from the left side of her face. The teardrop-shaped mark appeared behind Annie's ear. Claire swept back her own hair. 2 marks. Same shape. Same place. Once, they had stood before another mirror trying to convince themselves coincidence was enough. Claire glanced toward Annie's reflection. Still think it's a coincidence? Annie smiled. Not anymore. The coordinator appeared again. 2 minutes, Annie. Claire picked up Ruth's photograph and handed it to her. You want this in your bag? Annie shook her head. Leave it here. She'd want to see. She already knows. Annie touched the frame once, then headed toward the curtain. Richard was waiting near the side entrance to the runway. He wore no company pin and had brought no entourage. Naomi sat several rows behind him. Richard looked at Annie's dress, then at her face. I'm proud of you. Months earlier, Annie would have thanked Mr. Whitmore and kept walking. This time she stopped. Thanks, Dad. Richard's expression changed so quickly that Annie almost laughed. He needed a second before answering. Anytime. Annie turned toward the runway entrance as her name was announced. 18 years earlier, someone had tried to erase one woman from a powerful family story. Money had altered records, purchased silence, and turned prejudice into paperwork. But truth had left its own evidence. Sometimes in a photograph, sometimes in the courage of a woman like Ruth who refused to stop asking questions, and sometimes in 2 matching marks hidden behind 2 left ears, waiting 18 years for the right moment to be seen. This story reminds us that money, status, and influence can hide the truth for a long time, but they cannot erase it forever. Real justice begins when people stop protecting appearances and start taking responsibility for the harm their choices caused. It also shows that family is not defined by wealth, blood alone, or public reputation, but by honesty, loyalty, sacrifice, and the courage to stand beside someone when the truth is painful. Most of all, Annie's journey proves that being treated unfairly does not make a person powerless. Sometimes one voice, one piece of evidence, and one refusal to stay silent are enough to change an entire family's history. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.